Good morning. Some New Deal music for you. Let's turn today to the rest of the story on National Labor Relations Board. I got thrown off because of the week with the missing Friday. So we're getting a little caught up still. And tie it together, of course, with the Social Security Act. It came down about the same time with much the same purpose, trying to see what government can do to help the victims of industrial society who lose because of the poor decision-making of the elites, right? So it's one thing to try to prevent economic collapses in the first place with the Federal Reserve and those kinds of protections and economic policy. It's another thing to try to protect the people who are hit hardest by it. So we've talked a lot about labor unions, and we'll tell the rest of that story today. But what about that whole other class of people? The elderly, the Social Security Act, which we'll turn to this week. But yeah, how did it go with the National Labor Relations Act in Congress? Those of you on Zoom, sorry, the camera's not working, so you have to look at me up close. It's my computer, so I'll try to stand back. But yeah, what was the appeal of this law? Why did it seem to make so much sense? Well, who were its, did it have its opponents? Yeah, it's bad enough that unions happen for a lot of the big businesses, but add to that government support for them. But yeah, the real mastermind behind it all wasn't President Roosevelt, despite all of the credit that he gets in posters like that, right? He's like this heroic figure rescuing the working man. Roosevelt was certainly very supportive of workers and unions, but who was it that really designed this important federal protection? Yeah, Senator Robert Wagner from New York, New Deal Democrat from New York. And Wagner was the one who really had a plan that would actually work to try to protect those unions for the first time from the point of view of the federal government. Still though, all the credit seemed to go to FDR, the forgotten man, right? He's remembered by FDR. It ran alongside Lehman for the governor of New York, and drew a tremendous amount of support from labor unions there. And of course, you see Social Security was also very much on everyone's mind. Old age pensions, especially when employers would not cover it. But yeah, it was Robert Wagner. He was the real mastermind. And how did the hearings go? National Labor Relations Act hearings, and Wagner vigorously defended his law. And what did he say? As you read his speech for today. This is actually after it passed. But yeah, how did he defend his law later? What were the merits of it? Is business doing okay in America? Yeah, big business gets all the protections it needs already. Government affords a tremendous amount of help to corporations. Contracts protected. They can call in law enforcement, even at the federal level, to protect them against dangerous strikes. Isn't it fair that unions get similar protections? Granted, we've seen violent strikes in the past. We've seen them spin out of control at the hands of people uninvolved with the actual unions, Wagner says. But that's all the more reason to protect the unions themselves. Protect them from big corporations on one hand, but also protect them from violent thugs on the other. So yeah, what has the board done? He points out a few years into its operation, it had done tremendous good to protect the right to unionize as a basic First Amendment right. So yeah, similar arguments that he made in the initial hearings defending the bill before it passed. Sorry, I'm skipping around in time here. But yeah, how did it go in Congress? These hearings always invite a variety of people. And who was there to oppose this bill? An interest group. The National Association, oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, NAM, or National Association of Manufacturers, insisting that government support for these unions would allow the unions to just tear them apart. Their profits would sink, it would damage the whole economy. The greatest thing about the American political system, they said in these hearings, was the way that we could engage in contracts, right? Rational contracts that are not made out of emotion or loyalty, but just pure understanding between employer and employee, what he will be paid, what the hours will be, what the work will be. It's agreed to up front. The contract can be modified later out of a mutual agreement, but it cannot be forced. If you try to force the terms of a contract, then the other party is obviously not consenting. But it's all about that free and rational consent, they said. And so if the federal government throws its support behind these unions, it's going to allow them to just squash business. The line that was very disputed, which Wagner defended, was 7A, right? Section 7A, which appeared in the original National Labor Board outlined in the National Recovery Administration. But how does it go? Employees shall have the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist in labor organizations, and then to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing. And that's the really important line, because as we'll see later, increasingly representatives in the union apparatus are not of the workers' own choosing. But the purpose of this law was to make sure that they were, and it would take some subsequent laws to try to protect that. But yeah, representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other concerted activities, that's a strike, for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. And they shall also have the right to refrain from any or all such activities. Remember, you can also choose to not join a union if you want, and not be discriminated against for that reason. They can refrain for any or all of such activities except to the extent that such right may be affected by an agreement requiring membership in a labor organization as a condition of employment. So can employers or can unions require that all the workers in a place be part of a union? No. At the same time, can employers set up a union? Can you have corporate unions? Can't do that either, right? And so you'd have workers joining unions thinking that they were free and independent organizations, when in fact they were just creations of management and they were regulated accordingly. No more of that. It's all about the free consent and the choice of individual people to join a union or not, to do what they wanted within the union to advance their interests. That's it. And so Wagner defended this vigorously, and it passed with great support. The New Deal coalition, of course, in this year was huge in Congress in 1934. FDR was still immensely popular. But all throughout, he said very little about it, the president did. This was all Wagner's doing. He signed it into law, and it was called by Secretary Green of the AFL, remember the guy that replaced Samuel Gompers, the Magna Carta of Labor, in July 5th of 1935. Magna Carta, right? What was the Magna Carta? It was the old, yeah, the first precursor to a Bill of Rights, way back in the Middle Ages, right? Where the first time people asserted their rights against the authority of the king. Although, which people was it? Just the nobles, right? But still, Magna Carta, that name gets attached to the idea of assertions of rights. This famous painting, right, of the signing statement. There he is, FDR, signing into law, and standing just behind him is Senator Wagner, Secretary Green, and of course, his FDR's own Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. And here are the corporate interests, facing the hard facts, looking at photographs about brutality committed against unionized workers. This is going to end. And right away, like most New Deal policies, like a lot of major federal laws, it's not just a law that's enforced through an executive department. There's a whole new entity created under the Department of Labor. What is it? Who's going to regulate labor, or not regulate them, but protect labor unions and regulate big business? A very special board. The National Labor Relations Board is created by this federal law to do all of the things outlined in the law itself to protect these unions. And it's still with us. The NLRB is all about stepping into labor disputes. The federal government is here to make sure the dispute is settled. Although, what was different about the NLRB in the early days and the way the law itself was written? Who did it tend to favor? Business much? No, it was way in favor of the unions. It was extremely biased in favor of the unions. And of course, a lot of businesses were really upset by this. They said, hey, look, if you want fair negotiations, that's fine, but don't favor the unions over and over and over again. You can tell by the wording of the law, right? It's all about the unions. In second place, maybe comes the lone worker who doesn't want to join a union. But after that, the corporations, what did Wagner say in his speech in defending his law? They have enough protections. They're fine. There's nothing that the NLRB will need to do to be fair here. fairness is biased in favor of the unions as far as he's concerned. So that comes to be a problem later. So what are the challenges to all this? What did our journalists say? Yeah, what did Halgren say last time? Government protection of unions can also lead to what? What was Halgren worried about? Yeah, that's right. If they can protect unions, the government can control unions, right? I mean, government is a good friend when you do what the government wants. When you don't, they become your worst enemy, right? And so watch out. Well, that seems to be what could happen here. And indeed, as we'll see, that is what happens. The government does start to treat unions like their own wards. And accordingly, they can do with those unions what they want. So who are the major enemies of this board? And they get into a lot of trouble with it, no surprise. All the big corporations form that organization whose representatives testified at the hearings. The National Association of Manufacturers goes into high gear, especially with ad campaigns and pamphlets and film clips. And I looked everywhere for the one that I really wanted, and I couldn't find it. I was going to show it in class, but there are these really amazing film clips where the unions and the union members and the union leaders are portrayed as these dangerous communists. Remember Eugene Debs, people like that. You don't want to be associated with them. And the workers who work with the unions within the factories are these miserable, angry people who blame everybody else for their problems. And meanwhile, the free worker who contracts with his employer, who does a good job, who doesn't complain, and has no interest in unions, he's happy. Who do you want to be, right? And so NAM really amped up this sort of optimistic, patriotic American ethic of hard work. Why would you ever get involved in those unions? And of course, we all know they're really communists underneath. So the ad campaigns, especially the billboards, were really common. This one is especially famous. A lot of people don't know that it was National Association of Manufacturers who sponsored it. So you also had a new organization that formed about this time, which became the arch enemy of Franklin Roosevelt from the right, the Liberty League. About this time, in Japan, in Germany, in Russia, we see the rise of totalitarianism. That is always the consequence, Liberty League insisted, of government investment in the economy. No, government is meant to govern. It is not meant to invest. And every time government does get involved in investing, it also gets involved in regulating. And pretty soon you've got the apparatus for fascism and totalitarianism, like we were seeing in Germany and Italy and Japan and Russia at the time. No, private investment. That's jobs and freedom and opportunity. It's a very clear cartoon, right? And you, the worker in the factory, which do you really want for yourself, for your family, for your future of the country? Certainly private investment and private industry. So get government out of industrial business, whether it's the regulations from the NRA or protection of those labor unions that could easily become just this apparatus of the state if we're not careful, said the Liberty League. So yeah, this is a really powerful interest group. And for the first time, even though FDR came into office immensely popular, he does start to have significant enemies, as does the whole New Deal. But yeah, what are the other major enemies of the NLRB? You get all kinds of private corporations too, especially in the transportation industry, especially the big trucks and the buses. Greyhound bus lines start to openly refuse to comply with NLRB regulations. Remember, what was the problem with the NLB and prior organizations when it came to these regulations? Could they enforce they'd have these rulings from their committees, they'd have their regulations in place, the law was clear, and yet they could not enforce it. What do you do about that? Well, NLRB is finally put to the test. They can enforce these regulations, and these companies can be hit with stiff fines for not allowing workers to unionize, for punishing labor unions, for firing people for joining unions. And so they start to learn the hard way that this branch of the government really is effective, more than people thought. And then came the hearings in Congress. You had a very important committee Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette Jr., he was the son of Robert La Follette, the more famous progressive senator in the turn of the century. And he headed up the La Follette Committee, entrusted with looking back on the history of labor unions and what had happened to them, the violence, the intimidation, the Pinkertons, remember them, and the yellow dog contracts and all the manipulation of just doing everything these companies could to squash labor unions. And sure enough, the disappearances, right? The terror tactics practiced by the companies and their associates. What did the La Follette Committee say? Such a spy system, right? Corporations spying on their own employees places the employer in the very heart of the union council from the outset of any organized effort. News of organizers coming to a town, contacts the organizers made around among his employees, the names of employees who joined the union, all organization plans, all activities of the union, these are readily available to the employer as though he himself were running the union. And that's got to stop. And this is the purpose of the NLRB. So for Congress to fully recognize the brutality that unions have put up with for so many years was really something. But again, did the La Follette Committee or the NLRB ever acknowledge the trouble that unions themselves had caused? They talk about them like they're just pure and angelic, and like the organizers themselves are just these noble creatures that could never be out for their own self-interest. And true, people like Samuel Gompers were very selfless. I mean, there wasn't much to complain about with him. But at the same time, were the unions kind of aligned with organized crime here and there? Were there radical communists like Eugene Debs? Yeah, but somehow nobody paid any attention to that. The government was all in for the unions. So the law is there. But what was the lingering fear among Francis Perkins and Senator Wagner about what might happen to it, especially after what had happened in the Supreme Court, which had just moved into its beautiful new building with the big pillars, you know, the court that sits just behind the Capitol dome. And what did they turn around and do to the NRA? On Black Monday, it was called, yeah. Right. NRA was unconstitutional because of the chicken case coming out of New York City, that sick chickens do not affect interstate commerce. If they're transported across state lines, sure. But if they're just raised and slaughtered and distributed in New York City, like the Schechter brothers were doing, that's not interstate commerce, right? And that was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority from Congress to the presidency and the executive branch, right? So we talked about that. So there's this big, scary, dark cloud looming over the NLRB because of that law. Well, what did Franklin Roosevelt do in response? To try to protect his New Deal plan, to make sure that the court didn't pull something like this again, he took a really unprecedented move. What was it? Remember? Yeah, right. You had 9 justices. Roosevelt submitted a plan to the Senate saying, how about we raise the number from 9 to 15? Imagine 15 justices on the US Supreme Court, right? We're so used to 9, it's been that way for so long. But Roosevelt said, no, 15. And he also suggested a few other provisions, that they should all be required to retire at 70 years old. And there should be some kind of tighter regulation of Congress on the appeals process, which Congress can do. That's constitutional. But yeah, this was a drastic bill, though. It was, of course, the court packing scheme, as it was called. And you can see what Roosevelt was up to, right? His greatest fear at the beginning of his presidency was that Congress would not go along with the New Deal plan. But of course they did. Congress became, as we call it, the rubber stamp Congress. And in the case of the NLRB, they surpassed Roosevelt, right? They did it themselves because of Senator Wagner. But what about the court? There's Chief Justice Hughes, right? Is he going to fall in? Is the court going to fall in? That's the big looming question here. And if Roosevelt had succeeded in getting the Senate, that was the question, would they open up those appointments and grow the Supreme Court? The Senate has the power to do that. That would have forced the Supreme Court to become totally subservient to the presidency. Congress did it voluntarily. The court, though, it looked like it was going to have to be forced. And so as this bill was being considered, a case came before the Supreme Court, once again raising the question about the constitutionality of minimum wage laws, federal minimum wage laws. The court had already ruled on this and said, no, there can be no federal minimum wage laws in the Adkins case back in 1923. But now it comes up again as West Coast Hotel is sued for not complying with the federal minimum wage policy of the New Deal. It goes to the US Supreme Court, and then the court does something totally unpredicted, shocked the whole country. And what did they do with the federal minimum wage law? You would think they would strike it down like they did in Adkins, but they upheld it in the case of West Coast Hotel v. Parrish. This 5-4 decision, and the one justice in the middle was Justice Owen Roberts. He was a low-profile judge on the U.S. Supreme Court, didn't write a lot of opinions, and in fact, his vote in this case, he didn't even explain. He didn't write an opinion in the case. He just went with the majority. This was called, anybody know from constitutional law? The switch in time that saved the nine. Because if it weren't for that, if they had struck down that federal minimum wage law, it's very possible that FDR's court backpacking plan would have gone through. What happened here? Did the court cave to political pressure? That's how it's interpreted, but historians have pointed out that it was a little more complicated than that. Chief Justice Hughes knew Owen Roberts well, and he knew what he was thinking about the federal minimum wage law, and he said, no. Roberts had changed his mind about this before the case even came up, before the court packing scheme was even announced. Do you buy that? Or what? What do you think happened here? Did the court finally just give in to pressure from the president? Did they suddenly realize how unpopular they were? The child labor case, remember that? Adkins and protecting women and all these other cases. And suddenly realize, wow, we need to get with the times. We need to fall in, like FDR said. What do you think happened? Yeah.
I think that they came to political pressure because, like, by taking on a compilation, they could, like, preserve the integrity of the court.
Yeah, that's right. Protecting its integrity sometimes means being flexible and going along with what needs to happen, which seemed to be the situation here. Yeah, what do you think? Yeah. Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah, so I have to look it up actually, but I think a lot of them actually were. It was right after this case that a bunch of them retired. And even though FDR didn't get his way with the court packing, he did get to do what? Yeah, he appointed 8 of the 9 justices to the court. There was one Herbert Hoover appointee that hung around. So he was still very successful in shaping what the court would be in the future. And sure enough, by the 1940s, they backed way off on these Commerce Clause cases. And they basically told Congress, do whatever you want. Commerce Clause means whatever you want it to mean, go for it. And they turned entirely their attention away from commerce and contract and all that kind of thing, and business, minimum wage, and started paying attention to what? Civil rights and civil liberties. Yeah, sorry. Oh, I thought you had a question.
Do you think that they changed their minds before the court packing plan? Did any ever support that?
Just the word of Chief Justice Hughes. That seems to be it. So it's fishy and it's a big mystery, and there's a long ongoing debate. There's books and books written about this. I confess I've read many of them. What actually happened here? A friend of mine in grad school wrote his dissertation on this, arguing that no, it wasn't political pressure. They really did have a constitutional reason for why they changed their mind. So who knows? It's a great mystery. But still, what does this mean? So on one hand, you've got the NRA struck down, right, in the Schechter case. At the same time, you see the court willing to go along with certain New Deal policies in the West Coast case. So what about labor? And the case finally appears. Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, one of the biggest steel corporations in the United States, right up there with Carnegie and a bunch of others, flatly violated NLRA regulations and fired 10 of their employees for joining a union, right? So you realize what they're doing here. They're picking a fight with the federal government because they know they can take this to court. They're lawyered up, they're ready to go before they even fired the employees. They were just waiting for it to happen. Now the case is pending and making its way through the lower courts, which sided with the company, claiming that labor does not affect interstate commerce. Labor is just like the chickens in that case, right? If something is locally manufactured and produced at a ranch, even if it's in New York City, raising chickens, at a steel mill in a certain town, it's local. It is subject to state and municipal regulations, sure, but not the federal government. Congress cannot interpret the Commerce Clause as something that includes this. If you're talking railways, okay, fine, because that crosses state lines. If you're talking transportation of goods somehow, okay, that's interstate commerce. But manufacturing is local, said the company, said their attorneys, said everybody at the time. And so a lot of the advocates of the NLRB, including Francis Perkins, trying to explain to attorneys, and the banquet that he sat next to Wagner at the night before they knew the case was handed down, they were in an extremely dour mood. It just didn't look good. The steel company's arguments made sense, and it just looked like the court was not going to uphold this. And so the fateful day came, NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. And guess what happened? It was a total coin toss. Nobody had any idea how this was going to turn out. And what did the court do? Do we still have an NLRB? Yep, they said it was constitutional. A jubilant Senator Wagner on the cover of Daily News, overjoyed. He did not think this was going to survive. His signature legislation, his pride and joy, he thought it was toast. And the court turned around and said, no, it is actually constitutional. Why? How can this be? I mean, think about the company's argument, right? Manufacture is manufacture. It's local. It happens in one place, right? Transportation, that's commerce. That's interstate commerce, and it crosses state lines. But manufacture doesn't. And yet it was upheld. How do we explain this? Well, the Chief Justice, once again, Charles Evans Hughes, the same guy who wrote the other two cases, striking down the NRA, upholding the minimum wage law, explains himself. Forming a labor union, the court announces, is a fundamental right. Congress could seek to make appropriate collective action of employees an instrument of peace rather than strife. Definitely thinking back to the Pullman strikes, remember that? And the Homestead strikes, those really did affect interstate commerce, right? If union strikes can shut down the entire railroad system across the country, even if all the employees work locally, they don't leave the station, it still has an effect. Although activities may be interstate, meaning within the state in character, when separately considered, if they have such a close and substantial relation, that's the golden sentence, a close and substantial relation to interstate commerce. What constitutes close and substantial? If a train, right, crosses a state line, okay, that's obvious. But what if the goods on the train were manufactured for the purpose of being shipped out of state? Is that close and substantial? Oh, but what if the railroad company staff working in the station prepares the train to cross the state lines, which they themselves will not cross? Is that close and substantial? Yeah, apparently. How far does close and substantial go? Is that a precise term? No, it's like large, medium, and small, right? If he can give like a really clear and precise definition, okay, but he actually doesn't. And by saying that, Hughes opens the way for Congress to stretch the bounds of the Commerce Clause to mean a wide array of things. And we will look at some of those examples of how far Congress can go with this. But why couldn't he have been more precise? It seems possible that Hughes himself didn't really know. All he knew is that we almost had 15 justices on our court because the president was mad at us. Let's not cross him again. Let's come up with a reason, right, to say that this is okay, hence the close and substantial provision. Or maybe it's because he didn't finish his 4 years at Colgate. Then he would have been clearer. I don't know. Just kidding. So it is upheld, and the green light is on for the NLRB to move forward and for Congress to pass a variety of similar laws. What was the popular reaction to this? National Association of Manufacturers just screeched, "This is a travesty. How can we do this to the country? That is clearly not interstate commerce." Everybody knows it. The unions, however, were jubilant. It's on. The federal protections of our unions are indeed constitutional. And of course, most union leaders didn't know why, didn't care why. All they knew is that it was upheld. That's how we treat most Supreme Court cases, right? Just like yes or no. We don't care the arguments, but they still matter. So it moves forward. Well, how does it go in the coming years? So what happens to the unions themselves in the wake of this law? What happens to the AFL? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Through the rest of the 30s, it goes way down. It comes back up again. But yeah, through the rest of the 30s, it drops considerably. But then what happens with the AFL, which remember was a federation of smaller unions. It itself wasn't a union, just sort of coordinated all the other unions and would help them with their strikes. The AFL, headed up by William Green, successor to Samuel Gompers, started to look increasingly weak and ineffective. The AFL was kind of like the nice union that played by the rules. But then came another network of unions that was a whole lot more radical and started competing with the AFL. What was it? Yeah, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, chaired by a guy who was kind of like Eugene Debs all over again. John L. Lewis. His eyebrows were as amazing as the photo suggests. He was a very eccentric, wild union leader, and just had this kind of zero-sum understanding of things. And he didn't have a lot of confidence in the NLRB, even though it was very much in favor of unions, to manage their strikes and to help them. No, the CIO had to take things into their own hands. And so the AFL and the CIO are competing with each other for membership. And it gets really, really strained between these two organizations. The AFL plays by the rules. It trusts in the NLRB. The CIO, though, is just strike, and nothing else. It's the only solution. No surprise, the CIO attracted a lot of the really far left of the 1930s. A lot of the Eugene Debs types and the socialists and the communists who were really prominent in that era. The AFL, though, tried to keep being confident in the American way, right? So you have the moderates and you've got the radicals. What are you going to pick? And the unions themselves start to split up over this question. Half of them going with the CIO, half of them going with the AFL. Well, the great test of the NLRB comes along with the first major strike since the Supreme Court upheld it in 1935. 1937, what happens? No, I'm sorry, same year, 1937. In February of that year, you get a huge strike. And a newly formed union, the United Auto Workers, still with us today. Very powerful union. No surprise, because their product is in extreme demand, right? Cars are everywhere. Even through the Depression and the hard times of the 1930s, auto workers were doing well because cars were always in demand. And they staged a strike at one plant in particular, at the Fisher plant, that manufactured the body, the sort of frame of those cars that people drove in the 30s. And the bodies would be shipped out to other manufacturing plants and the rest of the parts in the engine would be put in. But by shutting down that one plant, everything came to a screeching halt. They supplied several other auto manufacturers with the basic body frame of the cars. And this wasn't a walkout strike. This was a sit-down strike where they just took over the factories and just camped out for several days. You see the guys in the Fisher plant with the calendar. How many days will it take? Well, the CIO got involved. John Lewis was on the ground, but there was one manufacturer that did not go along with this. The CEO, who was very famous, Ford said, "No way. We will maintain production any way we can." And then some union delegates showed up at the Ford plant to meet with a bunch of workers after they were off work. And what happened in the Battle of the Overpass, as it was called? They were greeted by a bunch of company thugs hired by Henry Ford specifically to prevent union organizers from meeting with workers. Ford hated unions. He did not. He was all about the National Association of Manufacturers. No way. And the photographs came out in magazines and newspapers of these union thugs, or sorry, these company thugs beating up the union delegates. This is what it's like. This is why we need the federal government to step in and do something to mediate the situation. And so public opinion shifts finally, very much in favor, right? So between the hearings, the Lafayette report, and this, right? Suddenly it seems like the country is more in favor of unions. They don't deserve to be treated quite this way, despite their radical politics, right? In fact, if they weren't treated this way, they probably wouldn't embrace radical politics so much. These companies are like little fascist organizations. We're not going to put up with this anymore. So World War II comes, and what happens with union strife? It quiets way down. Everybody's on the same page in the war effort. And of course, a lot of the unionized workers are off to war. And so the factories see a huge drop in staff, and all the emphasis shifts to defense manufacturing, and they're not going to unionize at all. And of course, who worked in a lot of the defense plants in this era? Yeah, my grandma. No, Rosie the Riveter. She wasn't Rosie, but she was there in San Diego. Yeah, the Rosie the Riveters putting together the planes and the tanks. A lot of women go to work for these defense contractors. So it's peaceful on the home front because we're all on the same page about the war effort. But sure enough, as soon as the war is over, like the year after it was over, the union strife is back. Only this time, what happened with the Taft-Hartley Act in Harry Truman's administration? 1946 midterms come, and the Republicans take back Congress. And it's a different kind of Republican than we've seen before. This was the first conservative Republicans. And who was their leader? A lot more to say about this guy. Son of the president, former president, yeah, that's right, Robert Taft, who becomes the arch enemy of Harry Truman, the president. The president had quite a few fights with unions himself, and in fact had sued some of them for huge sums of money for not complying with NLRB regulations. Like, we're going to protect you, that means you got to comply with our expectations. But he was still very supportive of unions in general. And so when the Taft-Hartley bill came along, sponsored by William Taft and, or sorry, by Robert Taft and Senator Hartley, what was Truman's position on this? What was the union's position? They called it a slave labor bill, right? Why? What did the Taft-Hartley Act do? Yeah. Yeah, exactly like Hallgren anticipated. If the government is your friend, it can also control you. And that seemed to be what was happening with the Taft-Hartley Act. It regulated the unions. It gave greater protection for non-union workers. It made the government more involved in like a neutral arbiter role rather than favoring the unions themselves, as the original plan said. This was immensely unpopular among the unions, and sure enough, Harry Truman said, "I will veto that bill." And he did in 1947. And it went back to Congress, and because there was such a surge in Republican support and such a rejection of the New Deal, remember, he had been FDR's vice president. What did they do with that veto? It was an override. Yeah, it's one of the great overrides in American history. And so the NLRB is around, but now it takes on a whole different role, right? You see the idea? Now it's not so much about protecting unions as it is just squashing both unions and companies. It treats them about the same way, stepping on them with the power of the federal government. That wasn't at all what the NLRB was supposed to do. And what did Wagner say about this? He was still around. His last speech in the Senate, he denounced this bill, agreed with Truman's veto, fought the override. He said it was untimely, troublemaking, reactionary, unfair, and unduly political. He left the Senate and went to the hospital with increasing heart failure. And as he was dying, he said it was the biggest heartbreak to know that his life's work, the LRB, was now being modified so drastically that it would not do what it originally did by the Taft-Hartley Act. So he went to his death feeling like his signature piece of legislation had been shot down. I mean, after all that, getting it through the court, getting it through Congress in the first place, just getting the federal government to care about unions. And now this? What happened with the AFL and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, in 1955? After years of competition and trying to outdo each other and becoming kind of these major rivals for union membership, yeah, what happened? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The Red Scare in the 1950s, Joe McCarthy, we'll get to that more in a second, and all the investigations in the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee, the CIO started looking really unpopular. John Lewis passed away in the 1950s at the same time that William Green did. And so both organizations are under completely different leadership, and they sit down and talk and negotiate a merger. And we see it today. AFL-CIO are still stuck together as one big network of unions across the country. And they persist in that same role today as organizing all the smaller unions of different trades and different regions and all the chapters across the country to organize strikes or negotiate before there's a strike. Hopefully that's what they can do most of the time. But still, through the 50s, there was a growing suspicion about who was actually behind these unions. Remember, the NLRA wanted to protect union members in their democratic activities of voting for their representatives, voting for their leaders. And yet increasingly, as you looked at the way these unions operated, they had bosses. The union boss, right, turned out to be this really powerful figure. And so the investigations began with the McClellan Committee. Senator McClellan called up a committee to look at union activities and say, hey, you know, we've beaten up on companies enough. It's time to look at the way the unions operate. And it's not like it was in the old days. And serving on that committee were two conspicuous brothers, John F. Kennedy when he was a senator, and New York Senator Bobby Kennedy, who had gone to become very prominent and famous in American politics. But they were behind these investigations. And there was one union boss in particular through the 1950s and 60s who really gained a lot of national attention. He was a lightning rod figure. Who was the Teamster boss? Teamsters are truck drivers, yeah. Yeah, Jimmy Hoffa, right. Jimmy Hoffa was a really shady character. He just seemed to defy all rules and conventions. He was the type who would, if someone sued him, he would turn around and sue them back. He was in court constantly. And he was subpoenaed to testify in this committee about what he was doing with the Teamster Union because the news broke. What was he doing? He was siphoning money off of the Teamsters pension fund, right? That huge fund for all the retired truck drivers, which, by the way, my dad is currently living on. He drove trucks for many years. So he remembers hearing about Jimmy Hoffa back in the day. Where's that money going? It was being matched by the mafia, right? And sent to fund the construction of casinos in Las Vegas. And despite all that, Hoffa maintained great popularity among the Teamsters because he was just this guy that seemed to just defy all convention. Is this story sounding familiar? Yeah. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And we see The Irishman on HBO. I was leading up to that. With Scorsese's classic lineup of Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. I think Joe Pesci plays Hoffa. That's right, The Irishman. It was based on a book. Well, yeah, what happened with Jimmy Hoffa? He got into so much trouble with the mob because he started saying that if they didn't do what he wanted, he was going to go talk to the FBI. Well, what happens to you if you say that to the mafia? Hoffa disappeared, just gone. And for years, nobody knew what happened to him. There's endless speculation about who killed him and, of course, where his body was. It was always a joke, like, you know where Jimmy Hoffa's buried, right? And there was these crazy rumors that he was buried deep in the concrete of Angel State, or one of the football stadiums. I forget which one. What's that? Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Yeah, just all this speculation, like where's Jimmy Hoffa buried? Are we ever going to find him? Well, finally, it turned out that there was a guy who came forward and said, "My name is Frank Sheeran, very old, about to die," and he said, "Yes, it was me. I killed Jimmy Hoffa. What happened to the body? I don't know. That was a different part of the mafia organization called the cleanup crew." But the phrase was, "I hear you paint houses," which is, of course, what the mob said to Frank Sheeran, the hitman. And in mafia lingo, that means, "I hear you're a hitman," right? And Frank Sheeran said, "Yes." And he took up the hit on Jimmy Hoffa because he was friends with Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa trusted him. So even though he distrusted everybody else, Sheeran was uniquely positioned to get Hoffa to trust him enough that he could shoot him and make the body disappear. So we finally know the truth. And based on the book, right, that came out a few years ago, right, Scorsese did The Irishman. Excellent Scorsese film on Netflix. Anybody seen it? Anybody else? Yeah, it's very, very good. So what does the future hold for unions? In response to those committee hearings and in response to Jimmy Hoffa, the assassination wasn't until the 70s, it was much later, but the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959, signed into law by Dwight Eisenhower, finally extends special protections to union members, right? Not just the unions, but to union members against union leadership. So it's hard to do much about Hoffa because he has so much loyalty, but at least we can prevent future Hoffas. At least we can make sure that unions are fundamentally democratically run institutions that serve the interest and respond to the expectations of their members. So yeah, what does the future of unions hold then? What happens over time? They hit a huge spike in the mid-20th century. Vast membership, protected by federal law. But then what happens to membership over time? By the 1980s, it goes down. By the 2000s, it's really low. In certain states, it's higher than others. Obviously, Michigan has high membership. California has high membership. But because of income increases in general, union membership has seemed less and less necessary. It's conceivable that in the next 10, 15 years or so, they will become so minuscule that they won't matter anymore in American politics. Or maybe they'll make a big comeback, who knows? Unions tend to fall along party lines. They are very much in favor of the Democratic Party. Members pay dues. The dues go to the Democratic Party as donations. But what happened in 2016 after this book came out? He doesn't mention it. While the unions continued to donate to the Democratic Party, forming what was called a blue wall across the upper Midwest and manufacturing parts of the country, how did large numbers of union members vote? For Trump, right? Despite the expectation that they would always be supportive of the Democratic Party and its candidate. Now, for a long time, it was about half and half between union members. So, a lot would vote Republican, even though their unions donated to the Democrats. But this huge surge to the Republican side was really surprising. So it seems like they are pretty much expired as a public force. Other factors too. I mean, what the students of history, Professor Hoyt Wheeler in particular, points out, their decline is because of failed recruitment tactics. Increasingly, people who get manufacturing and industrial jobs just don't want to do it. Increased opposition to unionization from employers. And what's really peculiar is that radical politics is much less interested in class now than it used to be. Because now, what is it focused on? Race, gender, sexuality, right? That seems to be the major cultural force for radical politics today. Unions, not so much. Union members are drifting very much to the right. And of course, Trump had a major appeal to those workers because early in his campaign and his first years of his presidency, what did he do? Remember Carrier Air Conditioner Company about to be relocated to Mexico? And as president-elect, he came and met with the CEOs and persuaded them to stay in 2016, just before Christmas, right? And so even though the unions are for the Democrat, when the Republican makes that kind of promise, they're going to go that route. So fascinating story, and the way that this this phenomenon is so deeply intertwined with Congress is well worth considering. I meant to get to the Rescue Act today. Let's do that on Wednesday. My apologies. I was going to tie that in with this and Social Security. So yeah, talk about the, they say in a little clip from Investopedia, a summary of the Rescue Act. Let's talk about financial crisis caused by the pandemic. Then we'll turn to Social Security on Wednesday. And there are a couple presentations I'll fit those into. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you then.